$4.2 million. That is what a single container ship paid to jump the queue at the Panama Canal on a Tuesday morning in October of 2023. Not to transit the canal, not to carry more cargo, just to move to the front of the line. The ship behind it paid $3.8 million. The one behind that, $2.9. Dozens of vessels sat anchored in the Pacific swelter for 37 days, burning fuel, missing contracts, hemorrhaging money every single hour they waited. At the peak of the crisis, over 150 ships were queued on both sides of a 51-mile ditch that carries 5% of all global maritime trade. Captains were on the radio making deals that sounded less like shipping logistics and more like hostage negotiations. But that was not the most important thing that happened. Because while the world watched the price of canal slots climb to numbers that seemed almost fictional, something far more dangerous was building underneath the surface of that story. A structural failure hidden inside a climate crisis, hidden inside a geopolitical rivalry that very few people in the mainstream conversation were willing to name out loud. But here is what nobody is telling you about that moment. The Panama Canal drought of 2023 was not a weather event with shipping consequences. It was a warning shot fired by geography itself, revealing a single catastrophic vulnerability at the center of how the modern world moves goods, fuel, and military hardware from one ocean to another. And the nations that understood what that warning shot actually meant have already started moving. Stay with me. Because what comes next fundamentally changes how you see every shipping delay, every container shortage, and every geopolitical chess move happening right now in Latin America. To understand why the Panama Canal matters as much as it does, you need to understand what the world looked like before it existed. In 1900, if you wanted to move a ship from New York to San Francisco, you had two options. You could sail 15,000 miles around Cape Horn, the frozen, storm-racked southern tip of South America, a journey that took 60 to 90 days and killed sailors with a casual regularity that would be unthinkable today. Or you could unload your entire cargo, haul it overland across the Isthmus of Panama by mule and rail, and reload it onto another ship on the Pacific side. Neither option was remotely efficient. Neither option could support the scale of industrial trade that the 20th century demanded. The United States understood this with an almost religious conviction. So between 1904 and 1914, the U.S. government spent the equivalent of $10 billion in today's money and lost an estimated 5,700 workers to disease, accidents, and the sheer brutality of carving a canal through 51 miles of jungle and mountain and volcanic rock. The result was one of the greatest feats of engineering in human history. A controlled water staircase that uses a system of locks, chambers that fill and drain with fresh water to lift ships up and lower them down, to move vessels across the continental divide, separating the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Here are the numbers that make this real. The canal's watershed, the system of lakes and rivers that supplies the fresh water for those locks, covers approximately 3,200 square kilometers. Lake Gatun, the artificial reservoir at the center of the system, holds nearly 5 cubic kilometers of water. Every single time a ship transits the Panama Canal, it consumes approximately 200 million liters of fresh water. That water does not get recycled. It flows out to sea. On a normal year, the canal processes about 13,000 to 14,000 ships. That is a staggering volume of water required to operate, and every single liter of it depends entirely on rainfall in the Panamanian highlands. The Canal Authority needs Lake Gatun to stay above a certain threshold, roughly 87 feet above sea level, to operate at full capacity. When the lake drops, the canal does not shut down. It does something more insidious. It restricts the draft of ships. Draft is the depth a ship sits in the water. A fully loaded supertanker or container ship might sit 48 or 50 feet deep. When the Canal Authority issues a draft restriction, telling ships they cannot enter at full load, every vessel that transits must offload a portion of its cargo before entry and reload on the other side. That offloading operation costs money, time, and port capacity. It creates cascading delays at every port in the supply chain. And it forces the largest ships to make a brutal calculation. Transit underloaded and eat the financial loss, or find an alternative route and potentially miss delivery contracts entirely. And then, on July 30th, 2023, everything changed. The Panama Canal Authority announced draft restrictions at levels not seen in decades. By August, the restrictions had tightened further. By September, wait times for vessels without reservations had climbed to over 3 weeks on the Pacific side. The auction slots, those extraordinary prices paid just to jump the queue, began appearing. And by October, 154 ships were simultaneously anchored and waiting, burning roughly $60,000 a day each in fuel and operational costs, just sitting still. The blow-by-blow breakdown of how this happened is a case study in how interconnected fragility works. The 2023 El Niño weather pattern, one of the strongest in recorded history, suppressed rainfall across Central America, beginning in spring of 2023. Lake Gatun's water level began dropping in April. At first, the decline was within normal seasonal variation, the kind of fluctuation that the Canal Authority manages routinely. But by June, the rate of decline had accelerated beyond seasonal norms. The lake was dropping at a pace that historical models suggested should only occur once every 50 to 100 years. By late July, the authority had no good options left. It could allow heavy ships to transit and drain the lake faster, potentially reaching a critical threshold where the canal would need to shut down entirely. Or it could restrict transits and draft, preserve the water, and impose the queue that turned into a financial catastrophe for global shipping. They chose the restrictions. What followed was a logistical earthquake. The first wave of disruption hit the liquefied natural gas sector hardest. LNG tankers, vessels carrying liquefied natural gas that has been cooled to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit, shrunk to 600 times smaller than its gaseous form for transport, are among the largest ships that regularly use the canal. Multiple LNG carriers were rerouted within days of the restrictions tightening. Some went south around Cape Horn. Some went east across the Suez Canal. The additional transit time for a Cape Horn route from the U.S. Gulf Coast to Asian markets added between 18 and 25 days each way. On a vessel carrying 150,000 cubic meters of LNG at prices prevailing in late 2023, that delay represented tens of millions of dollars in delayed revenue per voyage. This is not just a story about shipping delays. It is a story about how thin the margin is between global trade functioning and global trade fracturing. StatBomb. At the peak of the 2023-2024 crisis, the Panama Canal's throughput dropped by roughly 30 to 35% compared to its normal capacity. 5% of all global maritime trade flows through this canal on a typical year. A 35% reduction in that flow means roughly 1.7 to 1.8% of total global seaborne trade had to find another way around the planet. That sounds small. It is not small. Global supply chains are not designed with 1,700-mile detour buffers. They are designed for predictability, for just-in-time delivery, for the assumption that the canal is always open. The automobile industry felt it first. Japanese and Korean car manufacturers shipping to East Coast U.S. markets began rerouting through Suez, adding 2 to 3 weeks to delivery schedules. American agricultural exporters shipping soybeans and corn to Asian markets faced a stark choice: wait in the queue and risk missing the harvest cycle windows or pay the premium slots. Many paid. The average booking fee for a priority slot climbed from roughly $150,000 at the start of the crisis to over $4 million at its peak. A 6-month window where $4.2 million was the price of punctuality. Now the second layer emerges because what the mainstream coverage was missing entirely was the military dimension. The United States' 7th Fleet operates in the Pacific. The 3rd Fleet operates in the Atlantic and Gulf. In peacetime, when Washington needs to move naval assets between oceans rapidly, the Panama Canal is not optional infrastructure. It is a strategic necessity. A Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, for reference, is too wide to fit through the old locks. It requires the new Neo-Max locks that opened in 2016. These expanded locks can handle vessels up to 168 feet wide, 50 feet deep, and 1,200 feet long. The U.S. Navy routinely transits destroyers, cruisers, amphibious assault ships, and support vessels through the canal. During the 2023-2024 restrictions, U.S. Navy transits were not exempted from the draft limitations. They were not exempted from the delays. At one point, a U.S. Navy destroyer waited 6 days to transit. 6 days is an eternity in military operational planning. And here is where the geopolitical layer opens up into something that should disturb every person watching this. In December 2024, President-elect Donald Trump publicly suggested that the United States should retake control of the Panama Canal, citing concerns about Chinese influence over canal operations. Panama's government rejected the suggestion immediately and firmly. But Trump's comments were not made in a vacuum. They were made in the context of a documented, years-long effort by the People's Republic of China to establish economic and logistical influence at both entrances to the canal. Hutchison Whampoa, a Hong Kong-based conglomerate with deep ties to the Chinese state, has operated port facilities at Balboa on the Pacific side and Cristobal on the Atlantic side of the canal for decades. These are not minor facilities. They are the primary container terminals flanking the most strategically important 51 miles of water on Earth. In a conventional peacetime framework, this is a commercial arrangement. In a conflict scenario, say a war in the Taiwan Strait that required the rapid redeployment of U.S. naval forces from the Pacific to the Atlantic or vice versa, this arrangement becomes something qualitatively different. This is the part that matters. The question of who controls what happens at the entrances to the Panama Canal is not a trade question. It is a war-fighting question. And right now, that question does not have an answer that satisfies the United States military. So what does Panama do now? The country sits at the intersection of the most significant strategic pressure it has faced since the 1999 handover of the canal from U.S. to Panamanian control. It faces pressure from Washington on one side, economic dependency on China on the other, and a canal infrastructure that is genuinely, measurably, existentially vulnerable to climate change. Panama's options form a matrix, and none of them are comfortable. The first option is strategic accommodation with the United States. Panama could renegotiate the terms of the Hutchison-Whampoa port concessions, buy out or limit the Chinese operational role, and accept a deeper U.S. security guarantee in exchange. On paper, this has obvious appeal for the United States. In practice, it requires Panama to deliberately antagonize the largest bilateral trading partner it has outside the United States. In a region where Chinese infrastructure investment over the past decade has been measured in the tens of billions of dollars across Central America. Panama walks away from that relationship, and it walks away alone, with no guarantee that Washington's attention will still be focused on the isthmus in 2 years. The second option is managed neutrality. Panama doubles down on its traditional posture as a sovereign canal administrator, beholden to no great power, uses international treaty frameworks to insulate the canal from bilateral pressure, and negotiates separately with both Beijing and Washington. This is the option Panama's current leadership publicly prefers. The problem is that managed neutrality requires both great powers to agree to honor it. And right now, neither Washington nor Beijing is in a mood to honor much of anything. The logic of great power competition does not leave comfortable space for neutral choke points. The third option is accelerated climate adaptation that sidesteps the political problem entirely. If the water crisis that drove the 2023-2024 disruptions is the root threat, then the answer is engineering. Panama could invest massively in water conservation infrastructure, redesign lock systems that recycle water rather than discharging it to sea, expanded reservoir capacity, new watershed management programs. The Panama Canal Authority has already announced plans for water-saving basins and is studying a third set of locks. But full implementation of a comprehensive water security upgrade is a 15 to 25-year project, with a price tag in the tens of billions of dollars. The climate is not waiting 15 years. The fourth option is the one no one wants to say out loud. Panama accepts a form of limited U.S. military presence. Not sovereignty, not control, but operational access agreements similar to the arrangements the U.S. maintains at bases across the Pacific and Middle East. In exchange, the United States provides security guarantees against Chinese economic coercion and potentially contributes to the climate infrastructure investment. This option solves the strategic problem for Washington. It creates an enormous domestic political crisis in Panama where the 1999 handover is a point of profound national pride, and where any suggestion of returning U.S. military boots to Panamanian soil is politically radioactive. The fifth option is the darkest one. Panama does nothing, the climate situation worsens, the great power competition intensifies, and the canal becomes a permanent pressure point. Not because anyone chose conflict, but because the structural incentives made conflict the path of least resistance. Every option carries an enormous price. Pull back now. Pull back from the canal locks and the LNG tankers and the diplomatic cables and look at what this moment actually represents on the scale of the global system. The Panama Canal carries, in a normal year, somewhere between $270 and $300 billion worth of cargo. It handles containers full of consumer electronics, automobiles, agricultural products, industrial components, and military hardware. The 5% figure, the canal's share of global maritime trade, understates its importance because of what that 5% contains. The goods flowing through the canal are disproportionately high value, time-sensitive, and connected to supply chains that cannot easily reroute without cascading downstream effects. When the canal restricts traffic, it does not create a delay. It creates a pressure wave that travels through the global supply chain for months, showing up as inventory shortages, price spikes, and production slowdowns in places that have no obvious geographic connection to Panama. The historical parallel here is not the Suez Crisis of 1956, though that is the obvious comparison. The closer parallel is the period between 1904 and 1914, when the United States was building the canal and the great powers of Europe were watching with a mixture of awe and strategic alarm. Britain controlled the seas. Germany was building a fleet to challenge that control. And in the middle of it, a new piece of infrastructure appeared that would permanently reshape which navy could be, where, and when. The Panama Canal was not just an engineering achievement, it was a strategic trump card. And like all trump cards, its value depended entirely on who held it. Right now, the question of who holds it is genuinely, dangerously open. The economic tremors from a prolonged canal disruption do not stay in shipping markets. They travel. When LNG flows to Asia slow, spot gas prices in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan spike. When grain shipments from the Gulf Coast are delayed, food import costs in Southeast Asia and West Africa rise. When automobile supply chains stretch, manufacturing output in Germany and Japan and South Korea contracts. And when those contractions hit simultaneously, when the pressure waves from a 51-mile canal arrive at multiple continents at the same time, the result is the kind of inflationary shock that central banks cannot solve with interest rate adjustments. The 2023-2024 disruptions were a partial rehearsal for that scenario. Not a full shutdown, not a war, just a drought. And it was enough to move markets across 4 continents. Now consider what a sustained closure, driven by climate and by conflict, or by the compounding of both, would actually look like. The 3 futures that logic forces you to consider. The first future is the one the diplomatic community is designed to produce. It is the managed solution. Panama, with support from the United States and possibly a consortium of major trading nations, including Japan, South Korea, and the European Union, secures a major infrastructure investment package for canal water security. The Hutchison-Whampoa concessions are renegotiated in a way that preserves Chinese commercial access, while limiting operational influence at the canal entrances. Washington gets the strategic assurance it needs without requiring a formal military footprint. Beijing accepts the revised arrangement in exchange for continued access to canal infrastructure data and port operations in a reduced capacity. Climate engineering buys the canal another generation of reliability. This future is technically possible. It requires all parties to accept less than they want. In a world where every major power is currently maximizing, that requires a level of restraint that the current political moment makes feel almost fictional. But it is possible, and it is the designed outcome of every diplomatic conversation happening behind closed doors right now. The second future is the escalation scenario. It does not require an invasion or a declaration of war. It requires only a decision by Washington during a future Taiwan crisis or South China Sea confrontation or some as yet unimagined flashpoint to attempt to restrict Chinese-linked port operations at the canal entrances. Beijing responds with economic pressure on Panama and on the U.S., businesses that depend on canal access. Panama's government, caught between the 2 powers, makes a choice. Whichever choice it makes, it loses the support of the other side. The canal becomes a front in a war that has not been formally declared. Traffic slows. Insurance rates for canal transit spike to uninsurable levels. Shipping companies begin treating the canal as a liability. And the global trade system, which is operated on the assumption that the canal is neutral and available, has to rebuild itself around an assumption it has never had to make before. Every day that the underlying tensions are unresolved, this future becomes 1% more likely. The third future is the one that requires no dramatic decision from anyone. It is the prolonged standoff, the grinding default trajectory where nothing catastrophic happens but nothing gets fixed either. The canal continues operating with periodic restrictions driven by worsening El Niño cycles. Climate models suggest that by 2050, the Panama Canal watershed may receive 20 to 30% less annual rainfall than the 20th century baseline. That is not a projection from a fringe research paper. That is the median outcome from mainstream climate modeling for Central America under current emissions trajectories. The Canal Authority manages each crisis as it comes. Transit fees climb. Draft restrictions become semi-permanent features of canal operations, rather than emergency measures. Shipping companies build longer routes into their cost models as a standard assumption. The canal does not close. It just becomes slowly, incrementally less central to how the world moves things. And in the space that opens up, alternative routes, the Arctic shipping lanes as sea ice retreats, expanded Suez capacity, overland rail corridors across North America and Eurasia, absorb the traffic. The canal is not destroyed. It is made irrelevant by the slow erosion of its reliability, and the geopolitical power that flows from controlling the world's most important 51 miles of water quietly drains away with the lake water it depends on. This is the future that no one holds press conferences about. This is the future that is already underway. Here is the question that no one can answer right now. The Hutchison-Whampoa port concessions at the canal entrances, the ones that sit at the center of the U.S.-China-Panama triangle, are currently under review. Washington is pressing Panama to act. Beijing is pressing Panama to resist. And Panama's government is navigating a pressure that small nations have navigated at great cost throughout history. The pressure of being the geography that great powers need. The historical parallel from 1904, the moment when a new piece of infrastructure changed the rules of global power, ended with a decade that produced the First World War. That war was not caused by the Panama Canal. But it was shaped by the strategic logic that the canal made visible, that the nation which controls the choke points controls the century. What nobody is telling you in the final accounting of this story is that the Panama Canal crisis is not over. The drought conditions that drove the 2023-2024 disruptions are baked into the climate future of Central America. The geopolitical pressure that drove the December 2024 controversy is baked into the logic of U.S.-China competition. And the structural vulnerability, A global trade system that depends on one 51-mile canal getting enough rain has not been engineered away. It has been temporarily relieved by a wetter season and a diplomatic pause. The lake is filling again, the ships are moving again, the prices are back to normal, and somewhere in an office in Beijing, and somewhere in the Pentagon, and somewhere in Panama City, people who understand exactly how fragile this system is are watching the water level and waiting. The canal is open, for now.